Welcome back. You are watching Global Eye. Let's now shift our focus to another European nation, Italy, that would be going to polls on Sunday as it elects a new government. It's 71st in 77 years of post-World War II history. And if the polls are anything to go by, there could be a tectonic shift in Italian politics. Brothers of Italy, a far-right party, is expected to emerge the largest party, catapulting its leader, Giorgia Meloni, to the top post. The 45-year-old Meloni, known for her ultra-conservative views, would become the first female prime minister in Italy's history. She would also become the first far-right leader to lead the country since 1922, since the time of dictator Benito Mussolini. And to take this forward, we're now joined by David Broder, author of Mussolini's Grandchildren, Fascism in Contemporary Italy. Mr. Broder, thank you very much for joining us here on Global Eye on CNBC-TV18. Tell us about this shift in Italian politics and the rise of Giorgia Meloni. What does this say about the mood of the electorate?
Well, we've seen the far right become an increasingly important part of Italian politics in the last 30 years. Some of your viewers may know Silvio Berlusconi, who was the center-right leader who came to power in the 1990s, and he brought former fascists into his government, into the coalition for the first time. But what's different this time is that the far right, Giorgia Meloni's party, is going to be the biggest party. And it's doing so on a program of low taxes, but also drastically cutting immigration. It's a party rooted in fascism. It was created by admirers of Mussolini after 1945, after his overthrow and death. And in ways, it's moderated its policy and its tone, but it's very much a party created by people in that tradition. So in that sense, it is a sharp shift to the right for Italy.
Right. How would her view and approach be to the European Union? She has also said the European Union has been complicit about ethnic replacement. There was also a headline in The Economist which said, how afraid should Europe be of Giorgia Meloni? What does this really mean for Italy's ties with the European Union and also with the world?
Well, until a few years ago, Giorgia Meloni did propose that Italy should leave the Eurozone, abandon the single currency. She's often spoken in very critical terms of the leadership of the European Union, saying it was a Soviet-style bureaucracy. As you rightly say, she said that it was planning the ethnic replacement of white Europeans by Africans and Muslims, and adopted this very conspiracy theorist attitude. Recently, she's changed that a lot and very much emphasized her loyalty to the European Union, to NATO, saying in Europe she wants to change the immigration policy, but not to leave, not to split. And also she's committed a lot to arms supplies for Ukraine and support for the Ukrainian side rather than the Russian. So these are ways in which she's tried to mainstream her image, but also there's big contradictions. So in Europe, she's mainly allied to governments like Viktor Orban in Hungary and Law and Justice, the ruling party in Poland, who basically want to turn Europe away from accepting immigrants, who want to reject abortion, who want to push back against gay rights and against this kind of civil liberties. So I'd expect that she'll change the sort of civil liberties agenda in Europe a lot, but without actually seeking to leave the European Union or anything like that. Of course, the question is how her government would hold on faced with the growing energy crisis.
Right. And give us a sense of the economic mood in Italy, which may have given rise to her popularity and some of her economic priorities, some of her promises, which may be clicking with the voters in Italy.
Well, she's leading a right-wing coalition, also including Silvio Berlusconi's party and the Lega, another hard right party. And their big message is heavy tax cuts. Italy now has progressive taxation, so the less you earn, the less percentage you pay, and they want to replace that with a flat tax. So they want to radically reduce overall taxation. And they say that they're going to continue with the policy pursued by the outgoing government of Mario Draghi with respect to European recovery funds, after the pandemic, the new investment, but also they want to do things like cut back on spending on the environmental transition, and they also call for so-called tax peace, which really means less tax inspections, so which is appealing to small businesses. But I think that the problem they face is that, while Meloni is making a big deal about her free market positions, lower tax and so on, because there's such a strong crisis of energy prices and inflation in Europe, I think we could very quickly go into terrain where she'll need to follow a much more interventionist policy. Italy has had more than 20 years of economic stagnation, falling wages. And so, although, of course, the right-wing coalition is the strongest, we're also seeing a strong movement in favor of parties who want to boost income support for Italians. And so I think that's also a contradiction in the election we're seeing now.
All right, David, thank you so much for joining us here on Global Eye, putting the Italian election in context for our viewers and the rise of Giorgia Meloni as well. Moving on, there's unrest across Iran with thousands of women taking to the streets to protest against the killing of a 22-year-old woman, Mahsa Amini. She was beaten to death by the so-called moral police for not wearing the hijab properly. Human rights groups say at least 8 people have been killed so far in the protests. Several videos are surfacing online showing women taking off their hijab, some cutting their hair and wearing Western outfits in protest against the moral police. To take this forward, we're now joined by Anil Trigunayat, former Indian ambassador and also distinguished fellow at the Vivekanand International Foundation. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us here on Global Eye. Let me begin by asking you, what does this mean for the Iranian government and this moment in Iran's history?
Before 1979, Iran had been modernized or westernized quite a bit, as we know, during the Shah's time. And since 1979, when the current dispensation or Ayatollah Khomeini came to power, we have seen that there was a constitution which provided, the Article 20 of 1979 provided equal rights to the women and men both. But over time, it was due to the Sharia implementation that there were several restrictions on the personal liberties of women have been placed. And this has been off and on coming out in the open by way of protests. And we have seen sometimes the women also challenging the authority because they consider it is a religious imposition on their free will. But this time, as a morality police, or as a tabwa, or as it is called, what they have done in the death of this young woman has actually infuriated a very large population of the country. And there are also several other factors. For example, the economic downturn, the problems that are happening due to the pandemic, as well as due to the continuing sanctions. Iran happens to be the second largest sanctioned country in the world after Russia. So there is, of course, there are problems, and that's why President Raisi, in fact, tried to calm it down somehow. But then what we are seeing now is that there's anti-government and pro-government protesters, and there are clashes among them, and they are calling death to this or that. And those are the kind of things, and accusing evil strategy of the enemy, or for that matter, that the revolution's principles will not be defeated, or the values will continue to persist. Now, that is something that is going to not go down with the women, and they're continuing to oppose any imposition and trying to prevail in their own rights. Now, how it will go, we have seen what happened in 2019, and whether it will move forward in that direction, it remains to be seen. But definitely, we are looking at further escalation.
All right. And we had seen Mahsa Amini. There were reports about her being hit by the moral police, her head being banged against a police vehicle as well. The UNHRC has called for an independent inquiry. Now, these global calls for investigation, this global attention, how will this impact the Iranian regime?
Well, I don't see that Iranian regime will at all be scared of these kind of calls for investigations, because, see, they know that they're already under maximum sanctions possible. They've been hoping for the revival of the JCPOA, the new Iran nuclear deal. That is also not moving forward in the right direction. And therefore, anything further, they will be considered as intervention in their internal affairs. And I doubt very much that the Iranian regime at the moment will consider or give any lenient way in this. In fact, if as President Raisi said, that protests are permitted, but riots are not. So there is a very little difference and a razor thin margin when these things go out of hand. So there could be greater violence. But at the moment, of course, I think that if the government does take action against those who are responsible for the death of Khamenei, I think that there might be some tempers. But then there are deeper roots, deeper causes for this kind of the people's frustration that is coming out of the streets.
Right. And as you were referring to Ibrahim Raisi's statement about these protests, about this chaos being absolutely unacceptable, do you expect the government to deal with these protests with a heavier hand? And do you think these protests will make a permanent change in the way Iran functions? Ambassador Gunath.
Well, very difficult to say, because, see, the Iranians, the last time, as we know, 2019, they were able to control the protests. There were civil society groups, international community, everybody was trying to do that. Iran was also a bit cornered at the time, but they used force, and several hundred people were killed, according to the reports. And even now they have arrested about 300 people or protesters already. And one other thing that they've started doing is that there are pro-government protesters who might be the conservative people themselves. So you might see a sort of a confrontation among various groups, and that could lead to greater riots and the government choosing a heavy hand. That's quite possible. But for the moment, they are trying to calm down the situation, which looks very unlikely to me.
All right. Ambassador Gunath, thank you very much for joining us about the protests over the killing of a 22-year-old in Iran. And these anti-hijab protests are escalating across the country, and we'll keep an eye out for those as well. Thank you very much for joining us. That really brings us to the image of the week. Veteran CNN journalist Christiane Amanpour sitting in front of an empty chair. This was after Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi cancelled their interview for refusing to wear a headscarf for their meeting in New York. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.